I hope you enjoy the book selection I brought today for a brief discussion. Considering that it is a book of almost 300 pages, what we will see are just a few aspects. It's an interesting book, which is not very well known. Don't be mistaken, because this type of title sometimes gives a slightly negative impression. This is a book quite different from what you might be imagining. The Monk and the Philosopher is a very beautiful book that deals with a dialogue between a father and a son. This dialogue that took place in 1996 in Nepal happens between Jean-François Revel, who is a quite renowned French philosopher, member of the French Academy, including his son Matthieu Ricard. Basically telling the story so you understand the context. Matthieu Ricard was a scholar of molecular biology. He reached the point of pursuing a doctorate, and his advisor, his mentor, was a Nobel Prize winner with a very promising future from a scientific perspective. At a certain point, after presenting and defending his doctorate, he takes a trip, or rather, before that he had already made this trip, he visits Tibet and meets some Rinpoches, especially one whom he will have as a master, a great Tibetan master who lived in a rather isolated situation, but a man of fantastic wisdom. And he is enchanted by the wisdom of this Tibetan Buddhist. And he decides, instead of continuing with his studies and investigations, to leave his entire Western life and become a disciple of this man. And it's curious because when Matthieu Ricard met his Tibetan master, he didn't speak English, because this master had a young man who accompanied him and spoke English very well. In other words, he didn't have any interpreter to help them communicate with each other. And he is simply enchanted by the presence, the behavior, the wisdom that could be perceived in the behavior of that man. He is enchanted and decides to become his disciple. Now imagine for a renowned French intellectual who had great expectations for his son's career. Suddenly the son drops everything he was doing and decides to go to Tibet, to live alongside a Tibetan master. This was something very shocking. Obviously, the two continued maintaining relations, but the father was always a bit surprised, a bit displeased with this situation. In 1996, Aunt Ricardo already had some recognition in the West, becoming the Dalai Lama's interpreter for French, and finally, journalists suggested that Jean-François Revel go to Nepal and have a dialogue with him, showing the point of view of both. And from this dialogue, they create a book. They transcribe, then it's reviewed, and they make a book. So this book is nothing more than the confrontation between the opinions of a renowned French philosopher with a considerable, respectable body of work, with much recognition, and a Tibetan monk of Western origin, his son, who dedicated his life to becoming a Tibetan monk. And this meeting of these two points of view, reported and portrayed by the journalists who accompanied them, is of an uncommon beauty. They have common points. They have points where they don't understand each other at all. Even in the conclusion of the book, both remain somewhat hesitant about the other's point of view. Although they understand it, they do not fully agree. So it's a very interesting moment. I have often told you that, according to the Eastern tradition of the theory of contrast, it is in contrast that consciousness is produced. In the contrast between two such polarized positions and two beings so close, a father and a son, that is, with all the goodwill of one towards the other, but sometimes irreconcilable differences and sometimes very close points. You have gems in this book. This book will address a few things. Among them, I draw attention to what the title of the book says, Buddhism Today. It speaks a lot about the Buddhist doctrine in a beautiful way. But it also speaks of a confrontation between the ideas of the West and the Eastern world as a whole. Above all, a question, the question of the meaning of life. Considering that we have about an hour for the lecture, the time is very short. I brought you a discussion more focused on this aspect of the meaning of life. Jean-François Revel passed away in 2006. He is now deceased. He was a French philosopher, writer, and journalist with a highly recognized body of work. Matthieu Ricard was born in 1946 and currently resides in Nepal. He grows up in an intellectual environment where the people around him, he gets to know Igor Stravinsky. He meets the great philosophers of the time who frequented his father's house, great writers, in other words. He is born into the cultural effervescence of Paris. In other words, one of the places where cultural effervescence in the world is most evident. Knows a lot of things, establishes a comparison with a completely different world, and opts for the latter. Well, another interesting thing that's worth mentioning, I think some of you might have heard, is that in 2012, researchers from the University of Wisconsin in the United States, they called Matthieu Ricard. Actually, he volunteered, along with several people, various volunteers around the world, to take a test where they would see through a gamma ray exam. I don't know how it works, but they would conduct an exam to determine which of these men had the highest state of well-being, that is, radiated well-being, tranquility, self-control, serenity. And in this extensive research conducted in 2012, it was indeed found that Matthieu Ricard is the happiest man in the world, with a very significant and notably remarkable difference compared to all the others in the study. In other words, look closely, a choice to leave a world of luxury, comfort, prominence, for a small cabin in Tibet, living with a very simple man from the point of view. Intellectual of the West, of what we consider as the intellectual man. And he becomes nothing less than the happiest man in the world because of the fruits he obtained there, within that context. This story is very interesting, truly touching. Continuing. I will then discuss with you an aspect of the book. The book is nearly 300 pages long, as I already mentioned, so I had to make a choice. I took an aspect of the book, which is what pertains to the meaning of life. In this regard, comparisons are often made between Buddhism and traditional Greek philosophy, ancient, thought in general, philosophical. And it's interesting because Jean-François, who was a philosopher, makes a clear division, as if it were a rupture at a certain point, from the Enlightenment onwards, of philosophical thought, which was slowly abandoning this function of caring for some aspect of the meaning of human life, of seeking some meaning for human life. And he will explain this. He will show a series of viewpoints from ancient philosophy, which are tremendously similar to Buddhist doctrine, to Buddhist philosophy. This aspect is very beautiful, very interesting. We realize that there was a philosophical point of view in that ancient world, which is very curious as it has a single focus, teaching the human being to live as a human being, with a focus on values, with training in values. Face life as the construction of oneself. This is very present, both in traditional philosophy and in the Buddhist world. In fact, at a certain point, we will see that Jean-François says that perhaps the death of this type of philosophy has created so many interested in Buddhism in the West. It may be that this is why Buddhism is of such interest today. Perhaps the West misses itself at a time when these concepts were very present. So let's go. I selected a few excerpts that I will read, just a very few excerpts, which is what our time allows us. I hope you can savor it with me. So, starting with his speech by Jean-François, he talks about the meeting between him and his son, which took place in May 1996 in the locality of Hardaban in Nepal, and 6 in the locality of Radhaban in Nepal, in a site comfortably situated on top of a mountain overlooking Kathmandu. In other words, a somewhat paradisiacal place. The two met there by mutual agreement, decided to engage in this dialogue, and it's a good thing they did, because it left a beautiful outcome. Hey, the outcome of the meeting, as I mentioned to you, I summarize in 3 important points. A brilliant exposition of Buddhist doctrine and practice by Matthieu Ricard, and also a very intellectually brilliant defense, discussing his points of view. It's hard to imagine that these two could have had such brilliant ideas in the flavor of a dialogue. Certainly, this has undergone revisions. These responses are always very well crafted and provide a very deep exposition of the point of view of both. And they then show the question of the meaning of life from the perspective of Buddhism, ancient philosophy, and current philosophy. And let's go, then, to the first part. I selected for you, first of all, a passage from Matthieu Ricard himself, where he talked about the first contact he had with his master in Tibet. It seemed like I was seeing beings who were the very image of what they taught. They seemed so remarkable. I couldn't quite explicitly understand why, but what moved me the most was the fact that they corresponded to the ideal of the saint, the perfect being, the wise one, a category of beings that apparently is not found much in the West anymore. This was the image I had of Saint Francis of Assisi or the great sages of antiquity. An image that, for me, had become a dead letter. I couldn't go to meet Socrates, listen to a dialogue of Plato, sit at the feet of Saint Francis of Assisi, while suddenly beings appeared who seemed to be the living example of wisdom. And I told myself, if it is possible to achieve perfection on the human level, it must be like this. In other words, this coherence, this honoring of truths through practice, this depth in everything that is said, this coherence of thought, word, and action, which he so often noticed in ancient philosophers, he imagined no longer had a place in the modern world. And this shock he experienced with his first trip to India, meeting these Tibetan masters, was truly very striking. He says he discovered another world, where human beings live who have different goals, seek other things, and consequently, gradually become more truly human. In other words, they have a path that is much more about formation than information, much more qualitative than quantitative in his own words. I find this very interesting because I myself often use these words in my lectures. At certain times, it is a very common language, very similar to the one that we use in New Acropolis. It's very beautiful. Continuing. Jean-François is going to say, regarding his definition, I was just about to comment that it's almost a cliché to say that the characteristic of ancient philosophy is the alignment of theory with practice. How interesting is that, isn't it? In other words, this still exists as a clear memory. The hallmark of ancient philosophy was the alignment of philosophy with practice, of words with practice. For the philosopher of antiquity, philosophy was not simply an intellectual teaching, a theory, an interpretation of the world or of life. It was a way of being. The philosophy of one of these men, he and his disciples practiced it in their respective lives, at least as much as they theorized it in their speeches. In other words, the size of his words was the size of his life. There were no grandiloquent speeches for small lives. They were at least as big as what they were capable of saying, teaching, transmitting. At least the size of your words. What initially attracted you, he talks to his son, remember. What initially attracted you to these Tibetans was an attitude that is also linked to the very origins of Western philosophy. This is the reason why, in fact, philosophers indeed played the role of confidants, spiritual masters, mentors and guides, moral comforters, and uplifting companions to a large number of important figures until the end of the Roman Empire, especially during the time of Marcus Aurelius, which Renan calls the reign of the philosophers. In other words, he approaches his son and says, those Tibetans you find in the East, those masters, you would find them in the antiquity of the West. There were men here of that stature who also had the moral, psychological, and spiritual level to be masters, to be guides, to be those who point the way, with great loyalty, much coherence between word and life. We've had this here before. It's not very different. He supports this thesis throughout the entire book, to the point where Matthieu Ricard himself says, that's right, it's true, it's the same thing, we've had this before. In other words, it's an attitude that existed in the West. Not just be content with teaching, but through one's own way of being, be the reflection of what is taught. Be it classical philosophy, traditional philosophy, very similar to all the quests for wisdom that have existed throughout history. This was ours, this was Western. Of course, everything that is human is ours, but this was very close to us. Once again, Matthieu develops the following reasoning, which I found very beautiful, talking about the incoherence of the cultured Western man, the one who was considered a genius by Western civilization. The inconsistency between his brilliant works and his life as a human being. I had the opportunity to live with many of those who inspire admiration in the West. Philosophers, thinkers, theater men, artists, musicians, and poets. And I was able to evaluate, I was able to ask myself, is this what I aspire to? Do I want to be like them? His mother was an artist, his father a great philosopher and journalist, and their home was frequented by the great names of France at the time. Their talent, intellectual and artistic abilities did not necessarily make them good human beings. The genius manifested by these men in a specific area was not accompanied by the simplest human perfections, such as altruism, kindness, and sincerity. There was a reality there suitable to inspire my life in Tibet, to give it meaning. In other words, you realize that before he knew Tibet existed, which he came to know about through a film made by a friend much later, before he knew of the existence of these men, it's as if he internally already missed them. This type of reflection he already engaged in with the Parisian intellectuals he knew within his own cause. He missed that. But he was hopeless that there was any human exponent in the world who could correspond to these dreams of his. Continuing, we will see a passage from Jean-François where he will say, "This ancient Western wisdom is found, let's say, in the letters of Lucilius to Seneca, for example, and in the modern version, in Montaigne, for example, who gives us precepts to achieve a kind of inner freedom of detachment. He talks a lot about a certain point where philosophy takes a turn. But he says that even in more recent times, for example with Michel de Montaigne, we still find this need for coherence, this need for values. What does not prevent us from enjoying the pleasures of existence and especially the pleasures of the spirit? This philosophical path was globally abandoned starting from the 17th and 18th centuries. In other words, the idea of enlightenment, of the great classical rationalism, begins. Through the dialogue it established with modern science, which had just been born in the 17th century, philosophy increasingly oriented itself towards pure knowledge, towards the interpretation of history, leaving in the background the management of human existence and the search for its meaning. In other words, Jean-François himself, a recognized philosopher, says that philosophy has tried to keep up with scientific reflections and reasoning regarding evidence, phenomena, categories, and has significantly distanced itself from the search for the mystery of human existence, the meaning of human life. And Matthieu will answer. In other words, it was oriented towards the knowledge of facts. Jean-François responds, yes, thanks to the emergence of science, there is a conviction that there is something called objectivity, a knowledge open to all people and not just to the wise. See, there's already a jab from Jean-François. In other words, this philosophical knowledge was open to all people, not just the wise. And Bechet is going to give a wonderful answer. He says the following, spiritual knowledge is also open to all men who are willing to work to explore it. This is how someone becomes wise, meaning no one is born wise. Otherwise, an objective knowledge, accessible right away to everyone, without the slightest effort on oneself, can only be the lowest common denominator of knowledge. In other words, knowledge that requires no effort should be the foundation of knowledge, almost nothing. Because just as to be updated from a scientific point of view, to be developed from the perspective of wisdom, effort is necessary. But it is a path open to everyone, both. Therefore, they hold quite a similarity. Neither of them is given for free. We could also talk here, Matthieu, about a more quantitative than qualitative approach. In other words, it became more valuable for people to know a lot than to be a lot. They knew a lot in terms of accumulating information, but did not transform that into, let's say, moral, psychological, or spiritual stature. In other words, they didn't turn it into training. Notice a rich and profound dialogue. Admire Matthieu's readiness to find the right words, the right ideas, and Jean-François is sometimes also able to synthesize the decadence of the Western world, which is precious, even though he is eminently skeptical. Continuing, at a certain moment when the two were discussing the benefits of technology for the West, Matthieu responds to his father as follows, "But in those places, the quality of human relationships contrasts in a revealing way with that of the great Western metropolises." He talks about the Tibetan peasants he knows. In these places, life is very contrasting with Western metropolises. On the opposite end, when excessive material development leads to the creation of things that are not at all necessary, a person finds themselves trapped in the machinery of the superfluous. Without spiritual values, material progress can only lead to catastrophe. In other words, it's like putting a knife in a child's hand. A powerful instrument in the hands of someone who lacks the moral support, the necessary human support to know how to use it for the benefit of humanity. It's not about advocating for a utopian return to nature or what's left of it, but about understanding that while the standard of living, in the material sense as it is understood today, has improved considerably, the quality of life has degraded in the same proportion. Imagine a Greek pediment supported by two columns. One rose too high. The technical ability of man to deal with things, to deal with nature, along with the human ability of man to deal with himself, has not grown, has not developed. Evidently, this pediment is going to collapse, and this pediment is civilization. The nomads of Tibet and the peasants of Bhutan do not make a living in the same way as an American businessman, but they know how not to lose their life. They know how to win them in a different way, not letting their life be wasted. How? All men die, but not all men live. Many men merely survive, and that is to lose life. Surviving with all the comfort, with all the luxury, is still VIP survival. But just survival. Living is something else. These simple men, but with a clear sense of life and awareness of who they are and where they want to go with all this, are much richer. They possess something much more precious. They did not lose their own life from a human point of view. There are many moments when he says things that are beautiful. And they are a clear expression of what philosophy says, or at least part of it. A very clear expression. And it's no wonder that I've always loved Indian philosophy so much, especially Vedanta and Buddhist philosophy. In all these fields, in Taoism, in Shintoism, in all these areas, you derive very interesting philosophical maxims. And very similar. As I mentioned before, it's as if all the men who have climbed a mountain high enough see the same thing up there. In other words, the differences are determined by how much people have achieved some altitude, some verticality. Those who haven't climbed much have seen almost nothing. Again, Jean-François, he will talk about the current civilization. On the other hand, it is certain that this material civilization of applied science, of industry, can generate superfluous, moderate, and artificial needs. Epicurus used to say that each satisfied need, each need, creates new needs and multiplies the feeling of frustration. Plato already said this in his dialogue in the Republic, that when superfluous things begin to be generated, the decline of civilization begins. When he counters Glauco, when Socrates counters Glauco in the midst of building his ideal city, his republic, he says we start adding superfluous things, the decline of civilization begins. That's why today there is, look at that, 1996. That's why today there is a great demand for the philosophies of ancient Greece, as well as for Buddhism, which in this way reclaim their word. It's interesting that he says, at another moment, he mentions that there was a philosophy book launch in Paris, and by far the bestseller was Seneca. He says, well, this return clearly shows a need for meaning and for someone to illuminate the possibilities. A return to the essentials of life, which is to know yourself. And it's about knowing where we are going, what we will do with this life energy that has been given to us. Therefore, just as man leans towards the great Eastern philosophies, he also seeks his own past in the cradle of philosophy. Today, for example, Stoicism is making a strong comeback. He was already talking about that back then. Today, more than ever, Stoicism has been sought in every way. It has become tremendously relevant. We begin to realize what is truly missing in our lives. And Matthieu will respond, in any case, education should be more than just an accumulation of scientific, technical, and historical knowledge. It should constitute a true formation of the being. Look at how sensational this thing he says is, and it's basic. That's right. All of this has great value. Education in the West. Everything that has been built has validity. But look, this education should also involve formation, not just information. In other words, it should constitute a true formation of the being. The first and fundamental construction of man is himself. If he builds himself as a human being, as the biblical tradition says, everything else will be given to the nursery. And his response is perfect. Those who usually attend my lectures know how many times I have addressed this. This book was very surprising to me because it talks about things that are the foundation of philosophy in the way we do it. Jean-François, at another time, ask your child. Every now and then he asks some quite provocative questions, and here is one of them. He turns to his son and asks, "But then what you call knowledge is the initiation into a religious doctrine?" Matthias responds, "No. Knowledge is the result of an inner transformation." What is called knowledge in Buddhism is the elucidation of the nature of the phenomenal world, the nature of the spirit, that is, to elucidate, to shed light on the nature of the cosmos and the nature of man, from its most metaphysical sense to the physical. What are we? What is the world? It is, ultimately, and above all, a direct contemplation of absolute truth, beyond mere concepts. It is knowledge in its most fundamental aspect. It's the first and fundamental question. Who are we and why are we here? And Jean-François responds, then it is the philosophical question par excellence. This is the philosophical question par excellence, my son. And Matthieu responds, exactly. Exactly. In other words, what today makes people lean, for example, towards Buddhist philosophy in a certain way was present in their past. In terms sometimes almost identical. Matthieu, at another time, will talk about science. Your father insists, but you would have had a brilliant career, you would be recognized, you would have made a contribution. He insists that science is very interesting, but that he had a thirst to understand a meaning that justified life as a whole, and not just a small aspect of the cell of a microorganism. That he felt the need for a more global response, that he was not comfortable putting all his life's energy into a detail. And he will argue a bit about science in this passage. It is true that biology and theoretical physics have brought extraordinary knowledge about the origin of life and the formation of the universe. But do these insights allow us to elucidate the fundamental mechanisms of happiness and suffering? In other words, does man, after all this technology, find his fulfillment better? Does he suffer less? In other words, the example I always use, an example from our director of New Acropolis, who said, from the man who drove the chariot in Rome to the man who pilots the jet plane today, both the machine and the man have progressed. And machines, technology is always a means. The ends are always humanities. And they are always the object of philosophy in all the world's traditions. So the means have evolved a lot. If you're heading into an abyss, it's better to go on foot than to go in a Mustang. It takes longer, it arrives more slowly. In other words, the means don't hold much value when you lose sight of the ends. He will continue by saying that a person should not lose sight of the goals they have set for themselves. Knowing the exact shape and dimensions of the earth is undeniable progress, but whether it is round or flat doesn't change much in terms of human existence. Whatever the advances in medicine, it is only temporarily possible to alleviate suffering, because it always resurfaces and culminates in death. A conflict, a war, can be stopped, but others will arise unless the spirit of the people changes, expands, and perfects itself. On the other hand, is there no way to discover inner peace that doesn't depend on health, power, success, money, pleasures, or the senses? An inner peace that is a source of outer peace. Understands, isn't there a way for us to start by creating inner peace and then, as a consequence, generate outer peace? Do we really depend on so many artificial additives to seek happiness, and yet those who have them still don't find happiness? Wouldn't it be better to first look inside? Is there another path to external peace starting with inner peace? Folks, this is very beautiful and very philosophical. Later on, Matthieu will talk about the joy, the inner jubilation that a person finds when they feel free from all these ties and all these conditionings. And his father, Jean-François, responds in a very interesting way as well. That inner joy of man who frees himself from circumstances, is the common element to all wisdoms. It seems, at this moment, that I am hearing the description of the Stoic sage. In other words, from the philosophers of Stoicism. It is not surprising, in fact, that it was precisely in a scientific era, when philosophies abandoned the ideal of wisdom, which consisted of providing the recipes of this wisdom to the readers or listeners of the philosopher, that Buddhism gained a certain authority in the West. In other words, when Western philosophy abandoned the pursuit of wisdom, the eyes of the West began to turn towards the East, especially towards Buddhism. At a certain point, later in the work, Jean-François talks about his works that often went against the status quo of the time he lived in, and despite that, they achieved great success. Matthieu turns to him and asks, "How do you explain this mystery?" And he responds in the following way: if we could explain it completely, it would be possible to cure the illness of the spirit from which it originates. And this leads us back to the so-called first philosophy, the one that aims at the personal conquest of discernment and wisdom. Central theme of our conversations, in short. If we try to understand why the mystery of people being thirsty for knowledge that today is not public, not in fashion, not offered, we can understand the void that the absence of this first philosophy left, the lack that arose within human beings. And somehow, groping in the dark, they still seek this. A knowledge that turns towards the greatest of enigmas, which is the human being, and the greatest of the fruits, which is a human life fulfilled as such with the human being. You notice that there are moments when they are in full agreement, and your speech coincides very precisely at this point. The meeting point, because they align on many things, the meeting point of the two always has to do with the coincidence between Buddhist philosophy, in its purity, in its essence, and not some distortions that have been made, depending on the time and place, the original Buddhist philosophy and the traditional classical philosophy of the West. How they say similar things and how they both turn towards the same thing. The formation of man in values, giving a human sense to life, transforming man so that he fulfills his role in the world. In closing, Matthieu turns to his father and says, despite everything, at the end of the day, we more or less agree on the following. What gives meaning to existence is not simply an improvement in material conditions, because we are not machines. Nor are they solely the rules of conduct, because a facade is not enough. What gives meaning to existence is a transformation of being through wisdom. What a fantastic thing! If that's how it concludes, imagine the richness of a book like this. In other words, it's not an appearance, a facade, which I have often spoken about regarding the ethics of coercion and not of conviction, where a person, due to social coercion, adopts certain behaviors in which they, in fact, do not believe, nor have any affection for. Not simply the improvement of material conditions, which, as we mentioned, only enhance survival conditions, but are not capable of generating life, are not capable of generating values, are not capable of generating wisdom. but fundamentally, the need for humanity to move towards a transformation through wisdom. This for me is, at least within the piece, because I told you that I didn't focus much on the Buddhist doctrine part, which is equally interesting. But in this part, where there is a dialogue of a philosopher seeking the point of Western philosophy, which meets the Buddhist worldview, their conclusion is wonderful. In summary, what could we say about their dialogue in this excerpt I mentioned to you? They clearly discuss the coincidence between classical philosophy and Buddhist philosophy, which focused on the formation of man, self-mastery, the conquest of values, and fulfillment through wisdom as the only possible happiness. And indeed, he often mentions Stoicism. You'll get to know Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca. We have several of their lectures on YouTube. And you will see how similar it is, how interesting the similarity is. That also reminds me of other things. Stoicism sometimes reminds me of Taoism. Sometimes it reminds me of certain aspects of Confucianism itself, that is, how everything harmonizes. Once again, all those who have climbed to a certain altitude, the mountain of knowledge, look up and see the same thing, a tree. The one who goes very far cannot say what is there. And then the guesses are varied among those who did not rise. In those who rise, opinions coincide a lot, visions coincide a lot. The evasion of the fundamental question of existence in our days and the West's inclination towards the East. In other words, the vacuum that was created. Everything is questioned, all the details, but the essential question is forbidden. I remember a passage from that book Sophie's World by Justin Gardner, where he said for us to imagine that we could craft a little clay figure and breathe life into it. That he would immediately start walking and asking, where am I going to work? How much am I going to earn? What am I going to wear? What will my house be like? Without ever having the idea to turn around and look at you and ask, why did you make me? What do you expect from me? What am I? Who am I? What is my destiny? What is my ideal? You would think he went crazy. How could you forget to ask something like that? Take this boat here and let's make another one. This one has a manufacturing defect. And we forget. We forget the existential question. We forget superficially. Something inside us hasn't forgotten. And it continues to call for it. That's why, at this moment, so many voices from the past, from so many traditions, are once again finding attentive ears. And I toast to that. It's an excellent moment, even extremely necessary. Need to revisit education and culture focused on materialism and solely on the investigation of details, neglecting the central question of life. In other words, it's not that science is wrong, it is dedicated to what corresponds to it. But that the humanities should also dedicate themselves to what corresponds to them. In other words, science raises one pillar, the humanities should raise the other. In such a way that the one who advances, who raises the pediment of civilization, is prepared, like the human being, to use the tools they themselves create, for the benefit of humanity and not to the detriment of humanity. Anyway, that's basically what I brought for you all, for us to discuss. It's an encouragement for you to get to know this work. I myself was a bit apprehensive about the title when I saw it, but then I went to see that it was nothing like it seemed and that the book is very deep, very beautiful, bringing an approach to Buddhist doctrine in a very profound way. And two figures, one who is no longer with us, but the other is still among us, who showcase the best of ideas. Which is a meeting of the best ideas of the West with the East, at least for part of the time. Sometimes Jean-François is quite skeptical and can't understand some things. But in this aspect of the meaning of life, he reaches a common point. And that was very beautiful to see. Subtitle: